Call me Isabel. The story of how I was shanghaied into the feminist movement begins in Boston in the politically pulsating year of 1971. I was not pulsating, except for wishing that Nixon would appoint Ayn Rand as Secretary of Altruism. My progressive fires remained unlit. You may as well know, before we get any further into this, that my politics were and still are royalist. I believe in an absolute monarchy and the divine right of kings. One thing I like about Bloody Mary, she never said a word about lung cancer. I felt out of place, to put it mildly, amid the Harvard SDS atmosphere, but being from a family that has lived in Virginia since 1672, I had decided to live up north to engage in what writers call gathering new experiences. I kept waiting for the spirit of liberal enlightenment to benefit me professionally, but it did not. With mind closed and legs opened, all I gathered was lovers. I'm a native of Queen Caroline Courthouse, the Virginia way of designating a county seat, a tidewater hamlet on lower Chesapeake Bay named for George the Fourth's consort, Caroline of Brunswick, who is best remembered for refusing to change her underdrawers. She stank, wrote Lord Malmesbury with an admirable aristocratic bluntness in his diary. One of his extant letters containing the same observation is proudly displayed in our own town library as a tribute to the complacency of our patroness. The Queen's attachment to the tried and true was shared by everyone in town, especially my grandmother, who refused to use a telephone. She communicated with calling cards, turning down the corners this way or that with such druidic expertise that she could say, "I'm at home on Thursday, but will be out of town over the weekend attending a funeral," without writing a word. A firm believer in the theory that if time had any decency it would stand still, she liked to set a good example for it by appearing in historical tableaux vivants at colonial dames' soirees. Dressing in full farthingale to represent the spirit of old Virginia, she would march out to a drum roll, strike a suitable pose, and freeze in place. Freezing in place was the cornerstone of all Granny's thinking, which is undoubtedly why my mind-broadening move north did not work. One of her many definitions of a lady was someone who died in the same house, in the same room, in the same bed in which she had been born, and, though she didn't spell it out, conceived. Her fixation on stay-put living was such that she found it grimly fitting that my mother had went her one better and died at the table. It happened when I was 8. In an attempt to talk, laugh, and eat all at the same time in the manner of sprightly Southern belles, she swallowed a bone. My father took little notice of Mama's demise because it had nothing to do with the Titanic. Genteelly referred to as his hobby, his interest in the great sea tragedy was actually a monomania of the most degenerative kind. As far as he was concerned, anything that had happened after 2:20 a.m., April 15, 1912, had not really happened. In a steady-on course progression toward madness, he filled the house with ship models, drawings, and an exact-to-scale diagram of the fatal slit, which several people mistook for a vulva, recited the entire passenger list from memory, and whistled "Nearer, My God, to Thee" while he shaved. All this left little time for work. Ostensibly, he was president and general manager of the cardboard container manufacturing firm he inherited from his family. A profitable business in anyone else's hands, it started sinking as soon as Daddy took the helm. He insisted on making far more hat boxes than the modern American woman needed, and spent most of his and his secretary's office time corresponding with other Titanic freaks, an eerily formal lot who used Esquire and Your Obedient Servant, and held what has to be the quaintest prejudice of all times. They snubbed the Lusitania as an upstart shipwreck because it resulted from an act of man instead of an act of God. The other member of our household was Mama's younger sister, Aunt Edna, who worked as secretary to the rector of St. Jude the Impossible Episcopal, but whose real career was having cramps. The whole town knew about Aunt Edna's female trouble. She recited her complete gynecological history to anyone who would listen, made bets on when her irregular menses would start, and somehow connived to get 3 paid sick leave days a month from her boss, Father Chillingsworth, who personally interceded with the bishop on the subject of her delicate parts, and kept a record of her period on his Canterbury desk calendar with all the other movable feasts. Once he got it mixed up with Easter and wore the wrong vestments. After Mama died, Granny took over my raising, and the long battle for my mind began. Her chief task, as she saw it, was to break me of all unfeminine habits. The most unfeminine thing a girl could do, in her opinion, was become a bluestocking, as she called female intellectuals. So, when it developed that I loved to read, she set out to separate me from books with every weapon in her arsenal. First, she explained what happened to little girls who read too much. Your eyes will fall out. They'll just fall right out and go plop at your feet. You'll end up on a street corner with a white cane and a little tin cup. I can just see you going tap, tap, tap with your cane and rattling your poor little cup. People will say, there's that poor little girl who would listen to her grandmother, and now look at her with those big black glasses over her poor little empty sockets. When that didn't work, she tried the blood poisoning argument. If you read a book when you have a cut on your finger, the ink will enter your bloodstream and go all through your system, and when it reaches your heart, you'll die. You'll just fall down dead. People will say, that was the poor little girl who died while reading. The ink killed her. Only Granny could reduce the flower of Western culture to the status of an air bubble. The more she nagged, the more I read, the more she nagged. Matters came to a head when I was 17. I told her I wanted to be a writer. Why can't you be a true Southern woman like Kissy Pooh Carmichael, she cried. Mark my words, you'll wind up in the insane asylum if you try to go against nature. Mental exertion ravishes the female organs, too. You'll have trouble down below if you don't watch out. You know what they always say, a whistling woman and a crowing hen always come to a tragic end. College is supposed to be a time of growth and discovery. Granny, of course, did not want me to go, but I insisted. So, in keeping with her definition of compromise, I was enrolled in St. Mary's Star of the Sea Episcopal College for Women, a small select grave of academia located on Lower Chesapeake Bay in the town of Queen Caroline Courthouse. It was 3 blocks from home, so I kept on walking to school the same as before. Although as a student of the 60s, my only contact with campus turmoil was the evening news. The closest St. Mary's Star ever came to a riot was the time a mouse joined us for evensong, but the nearest thing to a controversy was a hushed argument over whether Bread of Angels could be sung as Panis Angelicus. The high church element prevailed as usual, so he sang it in Latin. Had any days of rage erupted in our Anglican enclave, we would have referred to them as days array. The local crab fishermen didn't call us soft-shell Catholics for nothing. To prepare for a writing career, I majored in literature and took all of the many zero-growth courses that St. Mary's Star offered, such as Advanced Latin, the Augustan Essay, the English Rural Novel, and Tragedy 303, an intensive seminar in the plays of Racine in which we were forbidden to speak except in Alexandrine verse. It was taught by Miss Dalrymple, who was Kissy Pooh Carmichael's adopted half-sister, a relationship so fraught with Ben Sinister's wrong-sided blankets and double cousinships that Miss Dalrymple was said to commit incest every time she took a douche. I graduated from St. Mary's Star qualified to do nothing except crossword pencils and ink and play Rhyming Sam in a traveling carnival, so I took a stenotype course at Queen Caroline Business School. I thought being a court reporter would be a good way to gather experience for writing, but no Lizzie Bordens or Black Dahlias came my way. Instead, I took boundary disputes, apocalyptic Southern-style car wrecks, and divorcing good old boys who broke down on the witness stand and sobbed, "I'll love her till the ocean wears rubber pants to keep its bottom dry." When I had been working a few weeks, my father wrote a note saying, "I hate this century," and shot himself. The next month, Granny died in the cemetery. Fell by a heat stroke as she was trying to read the worn inscription on a 17th century tombstone to see if it belonged to one of her ancestors. "She formed a cross on the grave," said Father Killingsworth in his eulogy. I had the choice of staying home and administrating with Aunt Edna or striking out to gather experience, so I left and headed north. I tried New York first, but it affected me the way the mention of Eleanor Roosevelt affected Granny, so I pressed on to Boston, where I made the mistake of renting an apartment in Cambridge that turned out to be next door to the Hare Krishna headquarters. It was an experience I preferred not to gather, so I moved out and tried Beacon Hill because I thought people like George Apley still lived there. I'd been living in the new place about a week when I crossed paths with Polly Bradshaw. What was to be my last day of peace and quiet started with a trip to the post office. I emerged from my apartment on the misnamed Joy Street to mail my latest manuscript, Beloved Rake, to Moth and Flame Regency Romances. It was my fifth sale to the brooding and writing crop genre, and by now I had a method down pat. I wrote them on the stenotype machine while I was drunk, and transcribed them when I was sober. As I walked into the post office at the government center, my manuscript was scorched by a boy whose flaming draft card had gotten out of control. He gave me a peace sign, or the finger, I couldn't tell which, and returned to his sleeping bag. On the other side of the plaza, a group of gay liberationists chanted, 2, 4, 6, 8, we don't overpopulate, and a person of uncertain gender wearing a Halloween skeleton costume marched up and down with a sign that read, Remember Kent State. I mailed the manuscript and started back home. As I was crossing the plaza, a strange, intense girl in tie-dye bell-bottoms and a Mao jacket rushed up and kissed me. I love you, she whispered. Pass it on. If everybody says it to everybody else, we can forge a chain of love to stretch around the world. I peeled her off me and crossed the street. On the corner, I was stopped by a boy wearing a placard that read, Save a Tree. He held out a flower pot containing a pathetic pine seedling. This is a tree. Do you know what trees do for you? Man, they're the best friends you've got. Like they breathe for you, you know? Like they work their ass off for you. Got any spare change? It's not for me, it's for the trees. I evaded him and trudged on up Joy Street Hill, picking my way through the dog droppings, the spacey college students in floppy felt hats decorated with Richard Nixon as a lesbian buttons. They were just standing there hugging themselves, but as I drew abreast, they came to life with a vengeance. Lips curled, and a boy clenched his fist and shook it at me. Reactionary! How did he know? I wasn't wearing anything expensive, just a plaid skirt and a sweater set with a single strand of cultured pearls. This sort of thing was always happening to me since I'd moved north, like the time in New York when I was called for jury duty and the defense attorney took one look at me and said, Challenge. Defiantly, I tossed my head at the students and walked the rest of the way up the hill to my building. As I mounted the steps, I ran into the landlord, Vittorio Giappi, known to his tenants as Giappi the Wappy. The sobriquet had been started by the Martinellis in 2B, who claimed he gave Italians a bad name, and quickly spread through the halls like the recent fire in another of his buildings. When he saw me, he tried to conceal the crumpled paper bag he held. It was very full, but not at all heavy, which meant that he was on another light bulb stealing mission. Whenever the tenants in one of his buildings complained that their hall lights had gone out, he would sneak into another one and rip off the bulbs. Hey, you seen any hippies around here? He asked me. They're all over the place. No, I mean on the premises here. He waved grandly at the two scabrous row houses that were laughably affixed with little brass plaques, long gone to green, that read, Tradesmen and servants enter in the rear. We had hand-painted carriage blocks, too. One said fuck, and the other said suck. Joppy squared his ovoid shoulders proudly. I'm talking about commie bums that want to destroy our American way of life. Last night at the VFW, somebody told me that there was a bunch of them weathermen camped out somewhere on the hill. If you see 'em, call me right away. Here, we got to stop them creeps. My buddies and me want to capture 'em single-handedly so we can go to Washington and get hard hats from President Nixon. He laid a hand over his heart, his fingers caressing his rhinestone-studded American flag pin. I got my Plymouth Rock right here. My grandmother, rest her soul, wasn't in no DAR, but I love my country more than life. He had seen Granny's picture in full battle regalia the day I moved in, so it was meant as a dig. One of these days I was going to tell him that my grandmother wasn't in no DAR either. Like many members of colonial dames, she looked down on the daughters and frequently referred to them as Johnny-come-latelys because they required ancestors who went back no further than 1776. Joppy got into his car, which was plastered with flag decals and patriotic bumper stickers, including Support Your Local Police, Register Communists, not firearms, Remember the Pueblo, and Put Your Heart in America or Get Your Picture of a Donkey out. As I watched him drive off, I thought how comforting patriotism must be. I entered the building and climbed up to the top floor studio I had just rented. It was unremarkable in every way except for a pink marble fireplace. Naturally, the fireplace was no longer functional, but it was a shining jewel in Joppy's otherwise tarnished crown, and a pleasant reminder of the days when Beacon Hill's favorite George had been Apley instead of Jackson. The room had been part of a huge turn-of-the-century bedroom, which Joppy had divided into two cell-like apartments by tacking up a piece of fiberboard to make a wall. It was only slightly thicker than paper, but so far there had been no noise problem. Whoever lived next door was hardly ever home. I heard nothing except an occasional dull thwacking sound. I took off my good clothes and got into a pair of jeans and a Fork Union Military Academy sweatshirt that had belonged to an old beau. I mixed a strong drink, lowered myself carefully into Jalpy's sprung armchair, and lit a cigarette. Granny gazed in disapproval from her silver frame. Not because I was smoking and drinking, tobacco and bourbon are Southern vices after all, but because I was wearing jeans. They had been grounds for expulsion at St. Mary's Star, and even that anachronism paled before Granny's standards. She used to put on her hat to go out and get the mail. I turned on the TV, but there was nothing on except soaps and a local PBS feminist talk show called Heated Topics. I'd never watched it, but I had read about it in the papers. It was so controversial that it started with a viewer discretion warning and ended with a disclaimer. Despite these cautionary measures, they had been thrown off the air a few times. The last show to cause trouble was the one on do-it-yourself gynecological examinations, when they all started looking up each other's twats and turning their aisles of McGillicuddy to the camera. Having just finished writing a Regency, I couldn't take the soap, so I decided to watch The Feminist. While all the cautions and warnings and no-nos were on, I got up and fixed another drink and returned in time to be greeted by the moderator. She had long red hair parted in the middle and hanging down in the usual feminist style, a bony face full of freckles, and one of those long, lean Yankee builds. She wore a little Mother Bluer number that passed for a dress. "Hello, I'm Polly Bradshaw," she began, in a chowdery Boston accent. "This afternoon we will continue our 20-part series on alternative choices. On our last show we discussed natural childbirth. Our guest today is going to tell us about a really supernatural way to have a baby. Would you please welcome Miss Grace Garrison Talbot, President of the Birth Bucket League of America." Miss Garrison Talbot came on stage rolling a large clay urn on its rim like a spare tire. She wore her hair in a topknot stuck with a leather hat pin and a T-shirt inscribed, "Get back on the can." She took a chair across from Polly Bradshaw, righted the urn, patted it fondly, and began her spiel. "This is a birth bucket used for centuries by women before male physicians conspired to make us give birth in a prone position." The slide towards feminist English had begun. "When did the birth bucket originate?" asked Polly Bradshaw. It was a fatal question. Feminists can always trace anything back to a dry Atlantis. Miss Garrison Talbot launched into a tribute to the good old days, when every country was a matriarchy, and the world was full of wonderfully well-adjusted people who chewed on umbilical cords like beef jerky, and were so happy that they neglected to leave anything to posterity except the shards of their old birth buckets. Next came the standard tribute to those daredevil Celtic warrior queens with names like Bellatrix, who fill their birth buckets during pit stops at the chariot races. She finished with the tragic tale of somebody named Elspeth of Thuringia, who committed suicide in 1274 after her birth bucket was stolen from under her by a band of monks. "Our Judo-Christian heritage," Polly Bradshaw malapropped, her voice bleak. "Now I know what your first question is," said Miss Garrison Talbot. "Everybody always asks it. You must be worried about the baby's soft spot." I was worried about hers. She turned the birth bucket on its side so the camera could pick up the interior. "You have to put something soft in the bottom for the baby to land in. Ancient Egyptian women used crocodile dung. It's not available here in Massachusetts, but if you plan to give birth in the Gulf Coast area, your husband or the father of your child can gather it for you, as mine did. It's a good way to test his supportiveness. Remember, though, it must be fresh dung. The best way to gather it is to wait behind a crocodile who is moving his or her bowels. When the dung emerges, thrust a skateboard under the anus to catch it. Do not use plastic bags, or crinkly sound tends to anger the crocodile." "Is it possible to get dung from zoos?" asked Polly. Miss Garrison Talbot's eyes hardened. The zoos have been totally unsupportive. "What are the chances of setting up a meaningful dialogue with zoo directors?" "Non-existent," Miss Garrison Talbot said grimly. "We've tried to get our dung through the proper channels, but we were met with mockery at every turn. My car was even defaced. Someone wrote 'babysitter' on the windshield, and a male veterinarian referred to me as the ding-dong lady." Polly Bradshaw grimaced in disgust. "We will never be free until they stop calling us ladies. Grace, what are your plans for the Birth Bucket League now? Polly, we're going to fight for our rights to crocodile dung. We're setting up a letter writing campaign to put pressure on the zoos, and my husband is chairing the ad hoc Dung Now committee from his hospital bed in Everglades Memorial. We're not going to give up until every woman is able to purchase crocodile dung from the zoo of her choice. Beautiful. Right on, cheered Polly Bradshaw. In the meantime, I can recommend some substitutes for crocodile dung. Moldy bread is the best. Crumble it and line the bottom of your birth bucket with it. It's soft and a natural source of penicillin, which means it's sterile. And best of all, it's easy to obtain. Every active involved woman's kitchen is full of it. She turned the birth bucket on its rim and rolled it over to Polly Bradshaw. The League would like to present this to you in gratitude for your interest and your work in the women's liberations movement. Polly received her gift with effusive thanks and signed off. That's all for now. Join us Monday when my guest will be Bodacia Vigilant, activist, revolutionary, and member of the Women's International Terrorist Conspiracy from Hell, who will discuss her book, Disarming Rapist, The Surgical Solution. I turned off the TV, and I poured myself an even stiffer drink and brooded about the big publishing contracts feminists were getting. I wondered if I should try to climb on the women's lib bandwagon. First, I'd have to change my name. Isabel Fairfax liked the necessary agitprop crunch. I toyed with Zenobia Alert for a few minutes and then gave up. I had nothing to say to a feminist readership. I hope they all got raped by a battalion of Turkish cavalry. Not by the Turks, by the horses. I sat drinking, too tired to bother with dinner. Sometimes later, I heard my next-door neighbor come home, and soon the dull, thwacking sound started up. What was he, she, or it doing in there? I yawned at yet another drink and finally called it a day. Stripping down to pants and bra, I crawled into Joppy's lumpy couch and fell asleep. Sometime around midnight, I was blown out of bed by the explosion. It started as a great gulping roar, like a Wagnerian treatment of the belching of the gods, and turned into a blast-off worthy of Cape Kennedy. Before I had time to be scared, I was on the floor in the middle of a pile of books. When I got to my feet, the building was quivering. Outside, screaming people poured into the street and dogs barked all over the neighborhood. I stumbled through the book-strewn blackness and turned on the lights, which miraculously worked, and looked around. The 600 books I owned, which I had kept in neat piles all over the floor, were now in messy piles. But what really riveted my attention was the fiberboard wall that separated me from my next-door neighbor. It was starting to take on all the elements of a Regency novel. A ripping noise like the heroine's bodice, a corner-to-corner slit like the villain's grin, a buckling like the old baronet's knees, and a waft of powder filling the air as though from a dowager's dusted bosom. And of course, since no Regency is complete without the collapse of an old English sea-wall, the 2x4 stud snapped in half, and Joppy's chintzy room divider gave up the ghost. Now I no longer had to wonder who my next-door neighbor was. All I had to do was look into the other apartment. There, sprawled on the floor, wearing an I Am a Human Being nightshirt and clutching the birth bucket, was Polly Bradshaw. We stared at each other. For a moment I thought I'd left the TV on. She was the last person I had seen before falling into bed half drunk. Maybe I hadn't really gone to sleep. Maybe I was still watching heated topics. Gradually my mind cleared, and I remembered the P. Bradshaw next to my I. Fairfax on the mailboxes. I had noticed it when I moved in, but had not registered on me while I was watching her show. I was sure I'd not met her in the hallway, but that wasn't unusual considering the weird hours I kept. Night people never meet anybody. I saw you on television, I said unoriginally. Why not? It's already replaced E Pluribus Unum. What happened? Hearing sirens, we pulled on our clothes and ran downstairs. The first person we saw was Joppy in his VFW cap, talking excitedly with a crowd of policemen. He hurried over when he saw me. I told you so. There was weathermen, 4 of them, building bombs in my cellar. The dirty commies blew themselves up. How's that for starters? He was beside himself with joy. The decorations he had won in World War II were lined up on his lapel. The most prominent one was a good conduct medal with a spillover of oak leaf clusters. He must have been the company brown nose. Just then, we heard a policeman identifying the dead weatherman for a reporter. Naturally, their names were Farnham, Durham, Denham, and Bingham. Joppy the Wasp hater beamed. A few minutes later, somebody from the coroner's office arrived, and matters got ghoulish, to Joppy's unbridled glee. The coroner's man happened to be Italian too, so we were singled out for a real treat. He went into the smoking building and emerged momentarily with a container about the size of a dishpan covered with heavy black plastic. He handed it to Joppy like a thoughtful neighbor in time of need who says, "I want you to have this." "Farnham," he intoned, whereupon Joppy lifted the cover and picked up a finger encircled by a Harvard class ring. "I went to Boston College night school," Joppy said proudly. Over the next couple of hours, Farnham, Durham, Denham, and Bingham were found here and there in the shattered cellar of the house adjoining ours, and in the back courtyards of both. Joppy was like a child on an Easter egg hunt. Knowing he would never again be in such a good mood, I followed him to the ambulance where he was turning in afoot and told him about our wall. What wall? He had grasped the situation perfectly. Polly and I took him upstairs and showed him the damage. "When can you put up a new wall?" we demanded. His eyes slid off to the side in that familiar Joppy way. "Soon," he said. "When?" "Very soon. Just as soon as I see the insurance people." "When are you going to see them?" "Soon." He beat a hasty retreat. Polly and I looked at each other and then at the mess. In the middle of the now spacious room, lying half in my section and half in hers, was a Nixon dartboard. That explained the thwacking sound. We introduced ourselves formally, standing in the rubble exchanging pleasantries like two Londoners after a buzz-bomb attack. She asked me where I worked and seemed surprised by my answer. "Didn't you hear the typewriter through the wall?" She shook her head. "I've been doing volunteer work at the Self-Sufficiency Center every night for weeks. They need all the help they can get," she said gravely. An uncomfortable silence fell, brought on by the discoveries we were making as we glanced into each other's apartment. There was an Angela Davis Defense Fund poster in her kitchen. While I contemplated that, her eyes locked onto my mantel, where I had hung the sampler I embroidered under Granny's tutelage. "God bless the squire and his relations, and keep us in our proper stations." She turned to me with an inscrutable expression. "Well, I guess we're going to be roommates for a few days." "I guess we are." She was staring at my pile of National Review. "Well," we said in unison. We returned to our beds. Polly fell asleep right away, but I lay awake thinking that Joppy's ha-ha policy was probably with a ha-ha insurance company. He would never build a new wall. Never. I was stuck in this Jericho with a women's liver for a roommate. It was almost as bad as sleeping with Ramsay Clark.